Theater is something that human beings have been creating and performing and observing for almost as long as there have been human beings. It seems to be a central and fundamental human activity. So what is it about the theatrical experience that seems so tied to us as human beings? Why are we, and have we for so long, been drawn to theater? So Sarah, I'll start with you.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. I mean, I think, humans are strange in that we do this thing where we look at ourselves. And it gives us an opportunity to contemplate big questions, to revisit ritual, to bind a community together. And there is something very powerful about being able to sit and listen to stories with other people and to engage in that kind of communion. I mean, theater and religion both come from the same place of ritual. And so I think that there is a way in which, for some environments, theater becomes almost sacred.
I think that we tend to think of the theatrical space as a space of fiction. And many times that's not the case. In reality, we human beings are wired to be at play. And many times when we're performing roles or we're watching other people perform roles, the reality that is happening on stage is as real as the reality that we experience off stage. So sometimes I joke with students and I say, well, a simple example is that if you break your leg during a performance, the leg is not unbroken because the performance is over. So what is happening in that space is very real. It's shared by an ephemeral community. It's not it's a temporal community, right? But maybe exactly for this reason, it gives us the possibility to get outside of the normal ways or the typical ways in which we see relationships and understand stories and understand the other and ourselves. So it's a little capsule outside of the regular time, but it is not less real than the experiences that we have in the world.
Since the beginning of theater, virtually, one of the actions that it's performed is the act of social and political criticism. This is not something that is new to our time. When I was a teacher of literature, I taught Lysistrata, and so there is a history of social and political commentary, social and political activism that's woven into the history of theater. Is there some contribution to social criticism, social activism that is peculiar to the power of theater? I mean, there are lots of different ways that people have of trying to affect social change and comment on what's going on in the world around them. Is there something that theater does that is not equally doable in other forms, or something that's distinctive to theater?
Yeah, well, I think so. I mean, I think especially when we're confronting difficult, controversial topics, that theater allows you to walk heart first into thinking about it.
Yeah, that's great. So I love that. So what is that? I love that phrase.
Yeah, for me, it really, I mean, it circumnavigates this want to argue because you're emotionally invested in the story. And I think, at Penumbra, I can recall we did Fences by August Wilson some years ago, and my father was in it. He doesn't perform any longer, but when he did, he was phenomenal. And this older white man from Duluth was waiting in the lobby for my father to come out. And for those of you who are familiar with Fences, it's the story of a Negro League baseball player who his batting average was better than Babe Ruth. He's based on Josh Gibson, who was a real person. And when my father came out, and so Troy never got a chance to really play in the major leagues because at the time they were segregated and Jackie Robinson hadn't broken that barrier. And Troy is a very troubled, angry man who's been belittled by this world, and embodying that role was very intense. And so he came out into the lobby, and this man approached my father, and he took his hands, and he said, "That was my dad up there." And he was shaking. And, you know, I've witnessed so many moments like that where people see themselves in someone who feels so very different from who they imagine themselves to be. And I think theater allows us to sit in the specificity of a cultural moment, but to come to it with an understanding that we do share some universal truths.
Mm-hmm.
But what I think that then comes in our roles, right, is that the art form or the medium itself, it is very powerful, but it can also be a very powerful medium to reinforce problems and assumptions and behaviors that we don't agree with anymore. So it's important to shape the kind of theater that you want to make. And like for me as a pedagogue, it's very important to be informing students to be thinking critically about what they're doing. So it's not just about being in a play or being in a dance concert, but what is the text that you're choosing? How are you approaching the text that you're approaching? How do you want to shape? Maybe you can get a text that you disagree with, but then you stage it in a way that criticizes it and makes then the problems that are part of it more evident for the audience. So for me, this is the advantage of teaching in a liberal arts setting. So I've said this before. I think that BFA programs generally prepare students to fit the market as is. And BA programs prepare students to break new ground in the market. So it is the theater of their generation. How do they want to think this theater? How do they want to reach audiences? That it is this kind of depth. So it's not just the training, or the acting training, or the dance training, or the technique training, but the critical thinking training. What are the stories you want to tell? How do you want to tell them? Why do you want to tell them? With whom do you want to tell them?
Mm-hmm.
And this is where I think we're really lucky to have you teaching for us.
Thank you.
So Claudia, you raised something really interesting. By the way, just so that you all know, we always get together and chat beforehand about what we'll talk about, and then when we actually get on stage, we always talk about other things, which is why I love this so much. I'm fascinated by the point you raised, that theater can be an agent of social change and criticism, but it can also be an agent of repression and the reinforcement of stereotypes and of the structure that exists. So as you look at the theatrical landscape now, what do you see? Do you see a medium that is trying to create a space for new voices, that is trying to articulate social criticism? Do you see a medium that is reinforcing stereotypes and broadly accepted values? What kind of mix do you see?
I think that there is some space opening, and this has not happened easily, right? And I think that it's really hard-fought space. And my reaction, broadly speaking, to a lot of the producing venues is that there is a kind of satisfaction with doing one piece by an author of color, or you cast two actors of color in a production and your job is done. Or, and the work is a lot harder than that. So this is where I think the state of the field is, that there's been some opening. There's still a lot more that needs to happen. I think that the majority of the stages in the country do not reflect what you see in the streets, the populations you see in the streets, the conversations that are happening. It's almost as if theater sometimes is a little bit slow catching up, right? I don't know, this is my impression.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting because theater is not apolitical. When you put a body on stage, it's a political act. And so we are not absent what's going on in the world. And in the last 8 years, I've seen a resurgence of stereotypes on stages, both locally and nationally, that I hadn't seen in a very long time. So you see a lot of blackface, red face, yellow face, and these are happening in major regional theaters. And so, I think there are times during which people think, we're over it, so we can stage these things and problematize them. But I've found that when I go and I witness these old, whether it's minstrelsy on stage or something like that, that actually what happens is that people are enjoying the thing that they're supposed to be critiquing. And it actually becomes more damaging. And it has a lot to do with the funding structure. I mean, most of these theater companies are nonprofits, and so we do a lot of fundraising, and 67% of the funding nationally available for theaters goes to 2% of our theater companies, and they are, most of them have budgets over $20 million, and they're predominantly white institutions. So the institutions that are resourced the best are invested in a certain kind of storytelling that is, does not include and often has deliberately excluded people of color.
Sarah, talk a little bit. I don't want to assume everybody knows about the story of Penumbra. So talk a little bit about your company and how it is in fact distinctive and the role it's tried to play, not just in the theater scene in the Twin Cities, but nationally.
Yeah. So Penumbra Theatre Company is a 42-year-old company founded by my father, Lou Bellamy, and a group of other black artists who, at the time, in 1976, were feeling that the representation of African Americans on our stages was limited to very, very stereotypical and small roles, and they wanted to create a space where they could live in full dimension and be able to really explore the depth and breadth of African American culture. And so Penumbra was founded inside the Hallie Q. Brown Martin Luther King Center in the old Rondo neighborhood. We've been located there for the entire duration of our life. And today it is one of the largest and among the oldest black theaters born out of the Black Arts movement, which was a time period when black artists were really trying to use art to promote social change and to get people out and active. It came right on the heels of the civil rights movement. It's with tremendous pride and great humility that I say that we're one of few who have survived that period. There were hundreds that closed. So much of our work is archiving our project and also commissioning new work. In 42 years, Penumbra has produced 37 premieres of new work by black artists, and we were the first actually to produce August Wilson, and have produced more of his work than any theater company in the world. So.
And these companies close because the funding is not available.
They close because the funding is not available, and increasingly they're closing because of competition in the marketplace. So I always say there's a difference between black theater and plays with black people in them. Black theater has a social justice imperative embedded in it that confronts racism and strives toward equity. Plays with black folks in them may not attend to that at all, and in fact may reinforce stereotypes.
May reinforce stereotypes.
Yeah. So all of us are seeing and hearing a lot about issues of diversity and inclusion around both gender and race in very visible parts of the performative world, television, movies, theater, award shows. And I'm interested in how that's playing out in both of your worlds. That is the world of a small theater company that's not on stage in Los Angeles, and in an academic world, an academic setting at a liberal arts college. Are the same issues being raised? Are you seeing more inclusion of people of color in the work that you do? Are there still barriers to students of color getting involved in theater, say, at Macalester?
I think that at Macalester and other institutions of higher education, of course, there's more work to be done, because we, the faculty, arrive with the theater of our generation. We arrive coming with a certain education. So I've said before, for me, the greatest epiphany as a pedagogue was to understand that there are many things that I can and should be teaching students, but the one thing that I cannot teach them is the theater of their generation. That is for them to figure it out. So it's a very fine line to be both trying to transmit a work ethics, critical thinking, an appreciation for technique and rigor, but at the same time to not be imposing, what was the political theater of my generation, because it was active, but the political theater of their generation by necessity will be different. Mm-hmm. At the same time, I don't see that there's an impediment for students of color to be in productions in the department, quite the opposite, but you are working with the population that is at the college, right? Mm-hmm. So if I could have like a big wish, would be that students wouldn't be afraid to come and do theater in a time in which there's so much pressure in terms of learning skills and getting a job. So I have been thinking a lot about the fact that we need to make more visible the different kinds of careers that exist in the performing arts, so that they don't go in this imagination which is from the world of high school that they're coming from, that either you become, Lin-Manuel Miranda on Broadway or nothing, because there's a lot in between, right? And so that's what I feel is like, what can I do as a department chair to be attracting and making the department more and more welcoming for students, and also to be making it more visible for them, the kinds of opportunities that this path can offer. So that's where I am.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly with that. And I think, there are certain areas of theater that really lack representation by people of color, and tech, the design world and crew, one of the things we try to do at Penumbra is train young activist artists, and actually there are 3 members of your faculty that teach with us. So Harry Waters Jr., Patricia Brown, and Marciano Silva dos Santos all teach our little high school kiddos. And I think just by virtue of seeing representation, you can imagine. August Wilson used to say, we are what we imagine ourselves to be, but we can only imagine what we know to be possible. And so we need to see representation in order to feel like there's possibility. What Lin-Manuel has created is that dream. Whether it's attainable is another thing, but every field needs a Michael Jordan. and so, even maybe a Michael B. Jordan.
So
there you go.
So most of you don't know, but before coming to Macalester, Claudia was at Wesleyan, where she taught Lin-Manuel Miranda, and you told me his honors project was terrific, right?
But it was a good experience. So this is my other point too. I think that one of the things that now that we have these fabulous facilities that have a lot of infrastructure, what I'd like to do as one way of supporting students develop their voices and who they are as artists is to support more student-initiated projects. Mm-hmm. And they will be green, and some will flop, and some will be wonderful and surprise us. But here's the space to begin nurturing, so that then they can make the transition to professional life in stronger, more ready, more prepared.
You have to fail.
You have to.
Over and over and over and over again. I mean, what?
Yeah, I've perfected it, actually.
I mean, can you imagine how many times actors auditioning hear no? and they still go do. I just look at actors and I'm like, how? And I work with them all the time, but I mean, you have to fail, and I think the more you can do that in a space like this with people who care about you and people who are really going to be critical, so that you are not walking arrogantly into a field that is full of a lot of different dynamics, whether it's about money. I mean, Broadway is a whole beast that, you know, the commercial venture is really different than nonprofit theater. And but I think it is in trying and testing and falling and then getting yourself back up that you build the conditions necessary to really thrive in this field.
Well, and
to push it forward and evolve it.
And to learn, like, what is it that matters to you? What are the stories that matter to you? You need to try, do, repeat, to learn how to work as a community and learn how to work collaboratively. You know, it's not, you know, it's sometimes people think like, oh, if I'm a good person, I'll be able to be a good collaborator. No, it's a skill. It takes a lot of practice, you know. So there needs to be a space for them, for the students to practice with appropriate guidance and to be supported. Yes.
Just to broaden this out a little bit, we're talking about all the things that theater can do. Is live theater an endangered species? So, you know, we're living in a world now where people are increasingly living their lives electronically and online and vicariously, where you could put on a virtual reality headset and it could literally take you to a seat on the front row of a basketball game or the front row of a concert. There's no particular reason why someday it couldn't take you to the front row of a theater. Do you worry that as our experiences are becoming increasingly isolated through technology, that the distinctive, peculiar, powerful experience of people sitting together in a theater together, experiencing something together, is going away? Or will it always be with us?
I think it will always be with us.
Good answer. That's the answer I wanted.
I have to believe that running a theater company, but no. You know, I think actually there was a period, I'll say about 7 to 10 years ago, where the field was like in crisis, and every national conference was about like, how do we live stream our theater, and how do we, you know, engage and it was just like, folks, this isn't what we do well. Like, this is not going to go well. And I think we're over it because, I mean, which is not to say that there aren't really exciting advances that are happening where technology blends with performance. But I do think that the more isolated we become because of these devices that we carry around all the time, the more we crave those experiences where we can come together and experience something raw and live and in the flesh together. I feel like it actually might be really good for theater.
Mm-hmm. That's my feeling too.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say that...
That's because you're both optimists.
No, I also see the thrill of doing something with their bodies when students are working. So the thrill of being in a dance technique class or creating choreography, or, you know, there is something very exciting about being in your body. So it's not just a matter of watching, but just the more... Sweating is a great thing. You know, sweating is a great experience, and I think that virtually, you know, virtual worlds don't, maybe, I don't know, don't invite you to do that. So...
You know, we were talking, it's interesting, as we were, you know, the field was kind of grappling with these issues about technology, and virtual reality came up. Some of the data that emerged was really fascinating to me, because it showed that a lot of people who are entering into those realities, that virtual reality, are people of color. And they're creating avatars that are often not people of color in those spaces, because they're able to finally get up out of their bodies and out of the racism that they experience in their daily lives. And so in that way, it's really interesting to think about what's going to drive that market. And you know, there's been some really interesting combinations of theater and technology. I mean, there was a play that was done at a theater company in Pittsburgh where it was a small piece, and the audience was, they were all hooked up to devices that measured the pace of their heartbeat. And they were watching a love scene between these two actors, and as their heartbeats in the audience increased, the scrim behind them was lit differently, and it would get deeper red. And
Oh, wow.
it was really cool. They were participating in so I think it can be really fun, but
Yeah, you can use technology without having to disconnect
exactly
from the environment,
Yeah.
from the space.
So we'll open it up for questions in just one moment, but I want to just to conclude our part of the conversation, bring it back to the physical spaces, because we are celebrating the creation of this new building with new theatrical spaces, new rehearsals, new dance studios. Both of you have the opportunity to teach here. Just talk about the role that those spaces, those facilities play in the work that you do, and why it is in fact so important to have those things.
One of the reasons why I decided to take the position at Macalester was because of the building, because it's incredible. I mean, the size of the facilities and the way that they're equipped just helps you in what you can teach. So, for example, the Fox studio, which is 2,400 square feet of a studio with a sprung hardwood floor, a wall that has a special paint so that we can work with digital projections. So you see, we're not against technology. So, no, and actually creates an interesting possibility, because you can have both projections. You can work with the projectionist, so virtual and real bodies, right? And the students are really good with creating this sort of stuff. The Huber Cycli Theater is fully equipped with a grid, with storage space, with the lighting booth. That's the kind of space where you can teach directing, like we're doing this semester, teaching directing, and then allow students to be experimenting, creating productions, because it is ready it's also a performance space. So all the classroom spaces are also performance spaces for us. And all the performance spaces are classroom spaces. The tension wire grid, where you can bring a whole class of 15 students to be doing hanging lighting instruments and understanding how those lighting instruments affect and inform the space and color. I mean, it's amazing. I have not seen this kind of facilities at any other liberal arts college, period. So I'm thrilled.
I think it's profoundly important for people understanding that this is a serious field that can change the world.
We want to open up this conversation and give you a chance to ask questions. So we have 2 microphones.
I'm curious to know what you think of other local theaters like Mixed Blood, Interact, Full Circle. Are there others we should be paying particular attention to in addition to Penumbra, who are carrying out the mission of equity?
Yes. We're so fortunate in the Twin Cities to have so many tremendous theater companies doing various work. Interact is fantastic. Actually, Penumbra partners with a group of organizations we call the Twin Cities Theaters of Color Coalition. So it's Pangea World Theater, which is in Minneapolis, New Native Theater, Theater Mu, and Teatro del Pueblo. Those are all really great theaters that are doing terrific work. 20% is another theater company that's doing really interesting work around LGBTQ representation and stories. Heart of the Beast, which is one of the great theaters that does puppet work, they're actually struggling a little bit. And we've lost some tremendous theater companies. I mean, people tend to think that once you've done well, you're kind of fine in perpetuity. But I always bring up Theatre de la Jeune Lune, which won a Tony and then closed the next year. And it was a tragic loss for our community because it was a really, really dynamic space. So we have to take care of our theaters. So thank you for that question. And one of the things I love about the department is the way that you're getting students out into the community to see work, taking advantage of this great landscape.
You've talked about sort of the need for funding, and that's a really, pressing question. That's a pressing question that all theater artists are constantly dealing with. And you also were talking about sort of the need for spaces, and a lot of spaces have closed in the Twin Cities in the last couple of years, which has been devastating. And talking about equity in theater and talking about inclusivity in theater, I just want to hear your thoughts as well on things like removing theater from these traditional hierarchical spaces, from spaces where there is sort of director and actors into spaces of ensemble devisement, and then talking a bit about sort of interactive and immersive theater, creating new spaces and new identities. I just want to hear your thoughts in terms of these structures of racism, sexism, and homophobia in theater, and how we can, as theater artists and as audiences, engage with theaters to break free from those boundaries.
One of the old habits of undergraduate programs and MFA programs is to try to be mirroring LORT theaters, right? Which is an older structure in which it is the director's vision and everybody is at the service of the director's vision. Right, so I think that one of the possibilities that we can crack in an undergraduate program is this idea of rethinking what is really collaboration. Collaboration is a word that people use all the time and know nothing about it. Don't know how they're really employing it. To reshape, first of all, this very vertical relationship between the director, the designers, the actors, the staff, and really be experimenting with ways of collaborating and creating together to use the department as a space for a laboratory is one of the biggest contributions that I think that we can give, right? I say you need to rethink hierarchy, not as a power structure, but as a difference in function. Right? So to be thinking that in a production you have different functions, if you're an actor, if you're a director, if you're a designer, but it shouldn't be everybody at this, this very vertical structure. So that's, I think, from my part as a teacher, that I think a lot about. And it's hard. It's hard. It means giving up things that you thought were going to work. It means learning to listen, which is a really difficult practice, right? Learning to wait. Sometimes you see that the other person who is collaborating, you already got to the place where you think something should change, but they're getting, and to wait. And not just push it and say, no, I got it, right? So that's on my part, what I feel is my role here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it might sound a little corny, but I believe that if you build it, they will come. There are so many theater companies that exist and do terrific work without space. I think that depending on the kind of theater that you're doing, it really lends itself beautifully to being adaptive and to really modeling solutions for a community. I'm not saying that artists who are resource scarce are like super, we're more creative when we have less. Definitely not saying that. But I do think that there is a way in which going to see a play in an office building after hours or in a park expands our sense of what's possible, and I think that's important. And the other thing I would say is, we no longer need the recognition of these old structures. We never did, but I think more so now we feel like we don't need them to stamp us and say you're valid.
It seemed as you were talking that you're talking about the importance of building social equity into the stages leading up to the production. So not just creating a performance of social equity, but also in tech and directors and the writers. And so I wanted to know how you and how others as theater makers go deeply into the work of building social equity into those stages. and how far that goes. Does it go into your funding, into your audiences? Like how much does that matter to the final product?
Yeah, that's a great question. And one of my pet peeves is when people create theater in a vacuum and then they go here and the community goes, this is awful. And then they go, let the actors explain what we intended to do. It happens a lot and the actors are like,
It does.
I think that, at least in our practice at Penumbra, we really try to be accountable to the Black community, which means that if somebody has an issue, I listen. That before I became the artistic director, I spent a lot of time sitting at the feet of the elders of the community and listening to what they felt was important and why they valued that space. And sometimes I think there are situations where you turn down funding because of the politics of a particular foundation or corporation. But I think so often what we see is that a lot of the conversation about social equity happens after the play is over. And, I think that the ways in which you spoke so eloquently about trying to kind of really deeply consider the idea of hierarchy and what we're mirroring in our practice is so essential. I think it's really important to have a diverse theater ecology so that you've got lots of people who are working in a lot of different ways so that it doesn't become, someone is the interpreter of this experience, that we are too complex and diverse as human beings to suggest that anybody could do that. Any one institution or one company could do that.
This is a liberal arts college. I'm interested in how you bring the theater arts to the broader community and get them incorporated into the program without being a professional actor or somebody in tech associated with theater.
I've been here for a year and a half. So I'm learning the city and I'm learning the institution and trying to bring what I have learned from my previous 17 years teaching. For me, the first initiative is to see, the Twin Cities is phenomenal in terms of performing arts resources and spaces, and you have huge theaters and you have small places. It has a lot of room. I don't think it is an accident that a lot of the MAC graduates in the performing arts have stayed in the Twin Cities, right? So for me, it has been locating what are the organizations in the community with which we can create a deeper relationship. And even for courses. So this past fall, Sarah taught for us a course on performance and social change and the excitement of Eleanor. And the course was taught at Penumbra. I would like to bring now courses to be taught at the Playwright Center. We're trying to do this outreach, but also students have come to me, they wanted to do a piece, currently untitled, it's still untitled, and they wanted to do this work, and I said, sure, the department will support you doing the work, you have the space, we want to present it at Penumbra for the community there. Can you support us do that? And so they're doing a performance there on a Tuesday evening, I think, this semester. So they'll create the performance here, and then they bring it there. I'm sure that there are many other ways with which we can be in closer contact with the community. It would be great if you have ideas to send them my way and suggest, because for me it's really, I'm in this honeymoon. I'm learning the city, I'm making new friends, I'm getting to know the students, the institution, and understanding what McAllister has contributed. And so it is a period of many, many ideas, and the more the better.
Cláudia, if I could just follow up.
Go.
An important part of your program that we haven't really talked about is dance.
Yes.
And so talk about, and I've been to virtually every dance concert for the last several years. Talk about the role of dance in your program in getting students who are not theater majors and maybe not even students who think a lot about themselves as artists involved in your program. Because my observation has been it's been an extraordinary magnet for students from all over the campus and from all disciplines.
And it is, and it has worked as such. I did speak about the sweating and
You
the
did talk about
importance
the
of
sweating.
I just want to. I think it is a gift that theater and dance are working together, both because they are discrete art forms and because they can also be collaborating. So actually for the inauguration of the new space, I'm collaborating with Win Fricke, who is a phenomenal choreographer, and we'll be doing a piece called Home that is about us landing on this new home, which is the theater. And we want to talk about different experiences of home as how the students are touched by it, as well as the place where we are. So we want to find ways of speaking about rondo and displacement, Native American land and displacement, but also about what are the immigrant families that the students come from, or how do they feel that they're going to create homes once they leave McAllister, right? Dance has served as a home for a very broad, different populations on campus. They come to take technique classes, they come to learn about art forms or dance forms that they were not familiar with. Patricia Brown teaches African-based movement. Her class brings students from all different sorts of background, and the classes really has become a celebration of culture and togetherness. So this year we started African-based movement ensemble, such as music has the music ensembles. We said, let's do that. But also the ballet class brings in people who never stepped into a classroom to take dance, and they come and take ballet one, right? So there is a great power also in, as I was saying before, being in your body is very powerful. And I think that in this time that students come to college, if we create classes that are both for students who may be advanced, but also for the ones who never had any dance class before, that it's an opportunity to be in your body with other people without necessarily using your discursive mind, without necessarily having to be structuring narrative, but to just be in sweat. So that's my...
You talked about a honeymoon earlier. I was thinking about my honeymoon in college. My honeymoon in college was when all of a sudden I realized the power of interdisciplinarity. When I realized that French and math and anthropology and my creative writing, when it all started to come together in a way that I was like, this is singing to me. And that is the power of this moment for students, to be able to pick and choose what they want to study and to have each of those disciplines be invested in equally. I mean, with the advent of this building, that it really is an opportunity for them to test and try, and there's lots of work out there that shows that actually our cognition changes when we invest in embodied practice. Our solution capabilities changes. And so I think if for no other reason than you're going to be a better public speaker. I mean, everybody has to present a paper at some point, right? So I don't know. I just think there's many ways that we can find invitation for people to come and try and test, and hopefully people will be so curious about the new building that see a class and go, I think I want to stand on a chair and say some things. I'll try that.
Looking at how you present yourself and use language, the pauses and the reflections and the importance of that, that's the stage that you live through and have an impact. So it really should be a mandatory, I think compulsory, required.
Yes.
You know, I remember if M. Glenn Wilson were here, he'd tell you Life of the Mind should be required for every single student in his particular chapter. But that's part of being and experiencing. So everything you do is so valuable. Thank you much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You know, just very briefly, the thing that I just want to affirm in what you're saying is, it's ironic, but learning to play another character actually invites you to be your most authentic self. And that's really powerful.
Please join me in thanking Sarah and Cláudia. That was absolutely fascinating.